Hi, welcome back to Enjoying the Word. We're thinking about some mistakes that we could make while we're trying to study and make sense of the Bible. And so the process, we begin by looking to see what the text says, then we need to learn what the text means, and then finally move into that final phase of considering what the text should stir within us and in our lives. And so thinking really about that learn phase, what are some mistakes that we could make? Well, one of them is genre override. I don't see this mentioned a whole lot, but I think it's worth being aware of it. What is genre override? Well, when we come to a biblical passage, we should always be aware that there are different types of literature, right? There's narrative, there's poetry, there's discourse in the most simplistic terms. And so you have kind of the key features of each of these. The narrative is the plot, characters in a plot where you have a tension created, a tension that rises, and then a resolution to that plot. So there's kind of the basic approach to narrative. When we're dealing with narrative, we need to recognize it as such. With poetry, we tend to notice that there are parallelisms in Hebrew poetry where the second line is building on, continuing, contrasting with, somehow connected to the first line. So for a complete thought, we need to deal with both lines, or 3, 4, 7, whatever it is we have, but often it is 2 lines. And then with discourse, whether it's a speech or a letter, it's a more direct form of communication. So we tend to notice the assertions and we tend to notice the instructions, the imperatives within that discourse. So all of that is really important, right? When we're looking at a Bible passage, we should be aware of the kind of writing we're dealing with. There are multiple genres, 6, 7, 8 genres in the Bible, but they all fall into these kind of 3 broad categories. And then there's, of course, more detailed types of writing, or forms of writing, I should say, figures of speech and so on, that come within those genres. Now, what is genre override? It's kind of the opposite of genre ignorance. Genre ignorance is where we treat the Bible as just a collection of theological assertions. And so you just read it trying to find the theological truth that you want to notice. Genre override goes too far the other way. It's where the genre is so over-influential that it undermines our understanding of the text. Let me give you an example just on this screen here. Look at narrative, for instance, right here at the top. When you notice that something's a narrative, a genre override step would be to say it's a narrative, therefore it's fiction. That doesn't make sense, does it? It could be fiction, it could be a parable. That is fictional in the sense that Jesus created the story rather than telling or depicting history. But when you're reading through Old Testament history, New Testament history, events in the life of Christ, just because it's written in the form of narrative does not mean that it's fiction. It still means what it says, but we recognize how narrative works. And there are some other examples of this that I just want to flag for us. In fact, 3 examples where we may be tempted to genre override, where the genre has too much influence and therefore the meaning of the passage is undermined for us. Without getting into details, but still flagging some important ones here, how about Genesis 1 and 2? Genesis 1 and 2, we've got the creation account, very familiar, and it doesn't take much awareness to notice that it's poetry. But then what? Do we say, look, it's poetry, therefore, ... Is the therefore that follows this statement that this is poetry, is that going to kind of drive us away from understanding Genesis 1 and 2 as trying to communicate something specific? I'm not going to tell you what my position is on Genesis 1 and 2, but I think it's important to look into it and to study it and to think about it. It's poetry. Does that mean, therefore, that it's not trying to communicate something specific, that it's not trying to get across features of timing or sequence or actual description? Well, you see, the problem with that is if we say it's poetry, therefore we can ignore what it's saying at some level, how does that work in the prophets? Most of the prophets are written in poetry. And so do we say, well, it's poetry, therefore we can dismiss the predictions, we can dismiss the descriptions of what was happening in the time of the prophet? Can we dismiss the timing references, sometimes very specific in the prophets? You see, poetry is a way of communicating, but it's not therefore automatically failing to communicate. Does that make sense? Okay, so Genesis 1 and 2. What about Revelation? Similar thing happens in the book of Revelation. People say, this is apocalyptic literature, therefore, and what tends to follow is that what you're seeing on the page in some way is being lost to sort of a symbolic, spiritualized sort of, well, it doesn't mean what it looks like it means. I'm not going to tell you what I think Revelation is doing and what it means, but I will say this. It is not simply apocalyptic, and it's not strictly apocalyptic literature. For a start, there is discourse, Revelation 2 and 3, 7 letters. That's discourse. The book of Revelation calls itself prophecy. And actually, if you look at the apocalyptic features, which are there, it shares some with apocalyptic writings of that era, but there's a lot of differences and distinctions. And so we need to be careful that when we read Revelation, we don't miss out on the blessing that is promised to us by simply overriding our understanding with the genre label. And then lastly, Matthew 27. Just looked at this recently, Matthew 27, round about verses 50, 52. You've got some descriptions of saints rising from the tombs and so on. The earthquake, those events happening around the time of the death and the resurrection of Jesus. It's easy to say, this is a poetic device, or this is apocalyptic in form. Therefore, it didn't actually happen. It's just trying to underline the importance of the resurrection of Jesus or the death of Jesus. You see the problem with that? If we're going to say, well, that is a genre influenced way of communicating, which it may well be at some level, but if it loses its historicity, its actual descriptive power for what happened, then what's to distinguish that from the resurrection of Jesus, where he literally, physically, actually rose from the dead and walked out of the tomb? If we're going to say this, well, because of the genre label, this didn't actually happen, it's just a way of emphasizing, well, are we going to say the same thing about Jesus? I hope not. You see the problem? The apostles went to their death still proclaiming that Jesus literally, physically rose from the dead. They stood by the accounts that were given in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so we want to be careful that we don't allow a genre label to cause us to lose what the text is saying. We do need to be sensitive to genre. I'm not saying dismiss it altogether, but I am also saying let's not go overboard and end up losing what the text is actually saying. It's quite important that we do recognize that. So keep reading the Bible, keep enjoying the Word. I hope this video has been helpful to you.